It's been a while, but we're here with a new episode of the Monte and Wolf Show right after the first week of LCK for the summer split. We didn't do a preview show because we're lazy, so deal with it. But we're back now for the regular season, into the playoffs. Maybe Wolf and I will do some content together at Worlds like we did last year. We'll see if Wolf gets hired. I hope you will, Wolf. I hope you will.
I hope so too, but I'm not holding my breath on that one based on what's happened over the last few international tournaments. But we'll see.
What do you think the higher odds are? I get hired by Riot or you get hired by Riot?
I think it's still higher for me. Sorry, Monty.
I also wouldn't accept it. So there you go. You would. But I hope you do. But in any case, we've got a lot of Korean League of Legends to talk about. So I want to start out because we didn't really hear from you because you weren't at MSI about your take on what happened with MSI overall and the Korean teams, because I know at least here on Last Free Nation, like Dom and I were pretty disappointed that the Korean teams really didn't even show their own styles or play as we expected them to. And it wasn't about them winning or losing. It's that we felt that really they didn't give the best games that they could have, especially against, Billy.
I agree. I also think that for the case of both Korean teams, like T1 and Gen.G both, I think they were a little bit slow to adapt to the newer meta that we were seeing. And when we did see, for example, Faker play Nautilus mid, like it was a little bit delayed, and it also felt like he wasn't very comfortable on the champion. And there were a lot of ways in which I think Gen.G, for example, could have adapted their draft and played more Jinx, for example. They didn't seem interested in that. And Jinx, I think, was so powerful at MSI, and there were so many engaged setups at MSI. Like, we went back to set up CC and pick-based compositions, and Jinx is incredible when she scales really well.
Yeah, but you would think that would be T1's meta. I mean,
know, right?
That's the crazy part, right?
So they didn't really like lean into that power that I think that I and it sounds like Dom also agree that they could have used and they would have been very good at, and they felt really uncomfortable in the meta, even though the meta was like I mean, it wasn't massively different than what we saw in summer, but it was significantly different, right? And I think the Chinese teams really played very well around that, and the 80 carries we saw obviously were very good at playing in that meta. And Ruler is a fantastic 80 carry player. We know this from his time in the LCK, of course, and I think he had a fantastic tournament. And just overall, the ways in which we didn't see the LCK teams kind of figure it out, and they kind of fell really flat when things started going very wrongly in those series against the LPL teams. I don't know, it just felt like their heart wasn't in it as hard. It felt like, for example, even Billy just wanted it more in a weird way. And I've from seeing what the Korean fan reaction was, especially during those losses themselves, like going online and checking some of the Korean community reactions and seeing what the Korean
What did they have to say? What did they have to say?
I mean, they were pretty upset, but I think obviously, especially the T1 fans, were just a little bit disappointed with T1's performance, and there was some frustrations with the coaching staff, as it often is with T1 fans, for example.
It's never the players. It's weird. It's weird how that works. It's weird how the T1 fans continuously get the coaches like replaced, and yet the same problems are made. How come it's never the players' fault, Wolf?
Well, I mean, it's Bengi now, who's a former player, and a lot of the T1 fans actually are also Bengi fans, so I feel like he gets a little bit less flack than coaches like Polt, for example, who wasn't even really the coach for T1, have gotten. But yeah, there was a lot of criticism of the meta reads. The other thing that I kind of felt like we saw in the LPL teams is great supportive play from the supports of the 80 carries as well as the mid laners, whereas in the case of GenG and T1, it felt more aggression we saw from Faker and Chovy, and a little bit more all-in plays rather than trying to set up Guma, trying to set up Pays for success. And when I tweeted this out, and a lot of Korean fans seemed to agree with that as well, I saw online, just that our 80 carries weren't empowered in the same way as the Chinese 80 carries were. Well, I mean, Ruler's not Chinese, but you know what I mean. The LPL 80 carries. So I actually just thought they were the better teams at the event. Like, I'll just be totally honest. I
Sure.
think that they were definitely better teams. This was not like an upset scenario. This is not like okay, RNG got blue side one extra time and we can pretend like we should have won. Like, no, they were just better, like massively better actually. So I have to
I
give
mean, the
credit
wins
where
were
it's
very
due.
convincing. The wins were
Yeah,
very convincing.
we have to give credit where it's due. Like, they were just the better teams at this event, both of them. Similar to how LCK were the better teams at Worlds, I think LPL definitely, this was an LPL dominant tournament, and they deserve the respect that they're getting online. And I'm honestly sad. I mean, this is an LCK show, but I'm a little bit sad that like the viewership hasn't increased massively in LPL, for example, on the English official broadcast, and there hasn't been that much new attention on the LPL because I think that region is a really fun region to watch right now, and they're very, very good and very competitive, and it's going to be an exciting Worlds.
Yeah. Also, I mean, honestly, the LCK and LPL both started off the season with a bunch of like really high profile banger matches. And this next week, as I'm sure we're going to discuss, is a lot less exciting than this week in terms of marquee matchups before we like ramp into the telecom war and like KT versus D plus versus Gen.G in the following week. So this next week might be a little quiet, guys, but we did get some good insights into the start of this. However, I did want to start by talking about some of the roster changes that have been made. Now, Korean teams notoriously do not make a lot of like big roster moves between spring and summer split. And this is really no exception. I mean, for the most part, like you see D plus Kia, they're running it back with the same roster. Gen.G, same roster. Hanwha, tragically same roster. Dread is still out there somewhere, not on Hanwha Life roster for reasons that God only knows. You know, KT, same roster. T1, same roster. These are all, you know, teams that are coming back. I mean, Brion, same roster. So
Yeah.
most of the top teams were not making any substitutes. The big signing was probably Teddy coming back and getting on Liiv SANDBOX instead of Envy, who was a kind of feast or famine AD carry player. Like when he was ahead, he was going to flash in and kill you. When he was behind, he was going to flash in and you're brutally int. Um, as well as some other smattering of changes, like Nongshim running, you know, with a new mid laner, have some changes for DRX. So do you want to talk about some of those?
Yeah, so I mean, Teddy's the big standout one, obviously, and I had heard rumors that he was doing very badly in scrims, actually. And then we saw that there was a show match between some of like the LPL teams players and then Liiv SANDBOX, like that was didn't I don't think have an official cast, but it was like streamed with like only the game audio, and I watched some of that, and that was like a week before LCK started, and he looked a little bit rough around the edges in that as well, and SANDBOX got crushed by those LPL players. But then we went into opening week and he played Varus, for example, which I was a little bit surprised by, but he had a great laning phase. And I think the losses that we saw from Liiv SANDBOX were not really his fault, actually. I
Yeah.
think he played quite well. Liiv SANDBOX just seemed to be struggling to figure out how they want to set up on objectives and how they want to start team fights. And it's a little bit disappointing for me because I thought that was one of the best parts about Liiv SANDBOX when they were at their peak in spring is they were really decisive, really good at objective setup. Wheeler was so good at setting up steals because they knew exactly how they wanted to deny the enemy jungler the ability to come in, and then how they would set up engages, for example, around that. And even Birdall, who had a really inconsistent season, looked really strong in those moments. And then you go to today's games, or this week's games, and Birdall's having a more serviceable laning phase, arguably, and he looks fine. Teddy looks really good in lane. You know, he's working really well with Kyle so far. But then you go outside of the laning phase, you start moving into objectives, and then Liiv SANDBOX look a little bit lost. So I think Teddy obviously is a very strong player, and I think that he will continue to be a good AD carry, especially in a meta like this. But I think Liiv SANDBOX needs to figure it out more than he needs to like get his mojo back. He looked a little rusty, but I think overall he's fine. And then some of the other changes we saw, Quad came back. He's just a Cassiopeia one trick that somehow is a pro gamer also. Like I don't mean to criticize this guy too much, but I mean he's better than Fiesta in some ways. Like mechanically, I'd say he's much better than Fiesta. But Fiesta could play real champions that make sense. And I'm not sure that we could say that about Quad yet. I mean, I think Quad can play real champions that make sense, but I don't know. Nongshim's not showing it to
All
me.
right.
So
I learned from LEC that you can just play Cassiopeia in any situation and it's fine.
maybe he's a big LEC fan. I know he got rank 1 with Cassiopeia. He's very famous for the champion, but I don't have a lot of nice things to say about him at this part of the season, so I'll hold off. And then the last big changes where we got Yehu and Poduk for DRX, and these are two players who, by the way, just to make it clear to everybody, they are academy players. But in Korea, academy is not your second string team; it's your third string team. So they are from the LCK Academy series, which is
right. It goes LCK Challengers and then Academy.
Yeah. And the academy teams are often players who are super young, ineligible to play in the pro leagues, and of course, including LCK Challengers in being a pro league. And the tournament is quite wild, actually. It's a tournament-based system. Like, they have a few tournaments every year. It's not like a regular season where teams kind of rotate through a round-robin system. It's not like that. So you have teams that are not even necessarily related to the LCK playing in this tournament. You don't have to have like your IDs in English still, as far as I know. So like when you watch that tournament, people have their IDs in Hangul as well. So if you're a Westerner, it's pretty hard to follow. And word on the street is, even though Pleta got, by the way, Challengers MVP, he's DRX's Challengers AD carry, he got MVP of the season. They didn't pick him, and they picked Poduk because, word on the street is, because they did internal scrim tests and basically did tryouts to see who was going to replace Duckdom, which is another mystery we don't have the answers to why he's completely out. Poduk did very well in those internal tests, and so far this week, he looks really good. So I'm kind of excited about him because he's so young, and I think the team's identity is changing a little bit around him in a way that they couldn't with Duckdom, and I think Beryl and Duckdom didn't get along. I think Poduk is young, so he'll do what Beryl says. So from a Korean hierarchy, perspective, I think that's probably good for how that synergy is going to go.
I mean, the thing is that what people will say is, why in an Aphelios meta, why would you get rid of Duckdom? Will be the first complaint, and the second complaint will be, why aren't you replacing Croco and Beryl, who were the worst performing players on this roster last split?
I mean, Beryl, yeah, it wasn't it.
You know what I mean?
So I think Chronicler has kind of an interesting take on this, in that because Croco's playstyle is kind of like, I am going in 100% of the time, all the time, no matter what, I'm going to be aggressive. Beryl is also a similar player like that. And you add Yehu and Poduk, who Yehu is the mid laner, and the K is silent in his name. He specifically asked that to be the case.
Because
So I know
his
that's
name
very
is
weird.
Kang Yehu.
Yeah.
The K is for his last name. So yes, that's why, guys.
So if you guys are confused, but we just have to say it once. I'm not gonna say it again, but yeah. You have these two players who are very young, and will just kind of, because they're players who don't have a lot of, I guess, pride in, like, I don't want to have a bad KDA because they're young, right? They're trying to prove themselves. I think they're willing to be aggressive and play around the plays that Croco wants to make and that Beryl wants to take. And Chronicler's take was kind of like, well, now that you have two players that are willing to just be crazy and go in and try to be aggressive nonstop, and Beryl can actually make those calls and people will believe in them and trust them, the team just looks like it has better coordination. I think that's so far somewhat true. I think Fate was a pretty reserved player. I think Yehu hasn't proved that he's better than Fate yet, but the games haven't really been about him as much as they've been about Poduk in those wins, and Rascal, of course, who's a very, very strong player. I think the best performing player on this roster. So I'm somewhat hopeful that DRX will not just be a total bomb team again like they were in spring. I'm not saying they're necessarily going to make playoffs, but if they continue to grow and Poduk actually becomes a good AD carry player, up there with some of the best, maybe they could make playoffs, and that would be exciting because I'm already like way higher on DRX than I think I was at any point in the spring season, like at any point.
That's impressive. And then Kwangdong continues to be maybe kind of exciting. They were sort of felt like they were on the brink of doing something with a lot of these rookie players this year last time. And look, their wins already aren't against anybody good, but it does look like another classic like CV Max product where they're steadily improving over time. And I'm very curious as to where this goes in the rest of this split, especially as they start to play against better teams. And they have to play Gen.G and Hanwha Life this next week. So we're going to learn a lot about Kwangdong, I think.
Yeah, the reports that we've been getting, because we talk to a lot of the coaches, and we usually don't like to reveal who gives information and who shares this stuff. So you'll have to like just trust me on this. But from everything that we've heard, the casters and I, Kwangdong Freaks not only are doing extremely well in the scrims and even beating top teams like D+, and even Hanwha, and have taken games and sets off Gen.G, but they have also been the team that has practiced the most during the off season. Like, they basically didn't really take a break. And I mean, they took a small one. Every team does, right? You got to go home, you got to see your family, etc. But CVMAX really encouraged the players to use the extra time they have to just train hardcore and become a really strong team. And I think already we've seen, albeit very weak schedule, that the team looks better coordinated than they did before. And the big standout for me so far in week 1 for them was that when they had advantages, they pushed them very well, which was something we couldn't always say about them last season. Their aggressive vision game was good. Bulldog is pushing advantages. They're looking for picks. They're playing around vision, setting up traps. Stuff that I thought overall we didn't see from them last season. Last season, we just saw like, okay, Bulldog's good mechanically. And, you know, sometimes they get leads and then they don't know what to do with them. Like, his laning was good. Now I'm like, okay, it looks like they've got the whole package. Like, they know how to play, they know how to draft well. It's not just drafting for weird picks for Bulldog. Good drafting, good aggressive plays from ahead. And it looked like clean League of Legends. Let's see what happens when they play against real teams next week. But so far, it looks good.
All right. So because, guys, we are going to see maybe not so many of the bangers of top teams facing each other this next week, I think we can say, you know, shelve some of the conversations about like Kwangdong and maybe some of the lesser tier teams, see if we get any upsets this coming week, because there's a lot to discuss in this meta with the two teams that are returning from MSI. GenG and T1 faced each other in this first week. We also had notable matches such as KT versus Gen.G, right? T1 versus Hanwha Life. KT versus Hanwha Life. So we got to see a lot of the teams that were in the top half of the table last split facing off against each other again. And all I have to say is that this time for real, it's the split of KT. Are you ready, Wolf?
So I know I'm going to get a lot of flack for this, but we do an overreactions thing on Pog State after week 1 where we predict what the final standings for the season are going to be. And we know it's like kind of ridiculous to actually try to act like we know who's going to be like first, second, third, all the way down to 10th. And I put spoilers. I put KT in second actually at this moment in time, and I put Gen.G first, KT second, and then T1 third.
I'm off of Gen.G, okay? I saw how they performed at international events. I saw the regression again. I wanted to believe, Wolf, after the bonkers Doran Gragas plays in the finals, after they came back from the losers bracket and adjusted their play, I wanted to believe that it was their time. It was not. Now, all my faith is going in the one true god of top lane, Keen, who has looked amazing at the start of this split. He is the best top laner in this league.
Yes. I think he definitely
He's better
is.
than Zeus, T1 apologists, okay? He's more versatile. He's incredibly versatile.
It's wild how it feels like it's almost right now, like it's definitely Keen is the best top laner in week 1, like easily, right? And then it's like, it's probably Zeus second, and then maybe it goes Rascal, and then it goes like every other top laner, and then the LCK, and then it's like Doran. No, it's okay. I'm being facetious, but like Doran has had a rough time. He has had a rough time.
What are you talking about, Wolf? His 0-4 Jax in the game versus T1. If he hadn't been there, you know, under-leveled, under-gold, you know, just waiting to hit those Counter-Strike stuns, then Pays would have never popped off, and they would have never come back from behind in that game 3.
So, I mean, are we going to talk about Gen.G first, or are we going to talk about KT first?
No, let's talk about KT. KT as the one man who can win on Malphite. Keen, the god of the rock. He can play tanks. Is he going to play Kayle? Yes, he is. I mean, Kale's good right now, but
yeah, Kayle is good. Is he going to play Urgot? Not yet, but he probably will.
But he could at any point in time. It's just amazing. Like I've always been a Keen lover, as people know. But after his incredibly garbage year last year, I was not anticipating that we would be in this position with Keen again this year. Like that he would be in the conversation for best top laner in the league. And you know what? Keen is not a choker, unlike Zeus. Keen showed the fuck up to the playoffs. You can't give him Jax because he just wins the game every single time. And the thing is that what I love about KT is that aiming is still going to play. They're still going to play Ezreal Yuumi because they're complete degenerates in the bot lane. But the thing is that they can lose gracefully, and they just put resources into Keen in the top lane, and Keen carries the fuck out of the game. And eventually, that Ezreal Yuumi just becomes online, and it does really well. And if you try to stop Keen from doing Keen things, well, then aiming is just going to pop off on the bottom lane, and everything's great. BDD still looking wonderful as well.
I think one of the cool things about KT is that, like you said, and this is kind of a point of contention between myself and the other casters as well, because I do agree with you. Like, often KT will just play around topside, and then aiming like Ghost of Dom 1 Pass will just like sit down there and eventually be relevant. Because he's very self-sufficient. He usually doesn't end up getting caught. He and Lehens can be aggressive though. And I think that KT now has the power to play both playstyles incredibly well. And I think that no other top team can really say they have that same power top laner where they can play around topside and still have a serviceable bot. I think you see teams like D+, Def needs resources to come online. If he ends up playing a slower scaling AD carry often, and they try to play around topside, try to play around Kana, it doesn't really work for them. They can play around mid, they can get Showmaker ahead, they can get Deft ahead, but Kana isn't the type of powerhouse top laner like Keen is, where you can go, okay, well, Keen's another win condition now in the mid game where we can set up fights with him extremely well. So they could both get aiming ahead when he is playing aggressive AD carries. When he is on the Lucian, for example, we saw a lot of games where Cuz will just aggressively come in and steal red buff away, try to set up dives on the bottom side, try to deny CS from the enemy bot laner. So they could do both, which is really cool. And the BDD is just clutch as hell. And when it's a meta where you're playing engaged champions, which it has been for a really long time, BDD is always going to excel. And I want to talk briefly about the next patch, 13.11, which is like the KT patch where Twisted Fate gets buffed, Rek'Sai gets buffed.
Hell yes.
So I think it's gonna be a good few
the
weeks
era
here
of KT is upon us. Prepare yourselves.
Yeah, I think KT has all of the pieces to be potentially even the best team in the LCK. It's just going to be about, can they actually play consistently? Because while aiming, we talk about how he does a lot with very little, and sometimes he excels with resources when he is given them. He also kind of ints sometimes. And if you guys remember the Ezreal game for the losers finals against Gen.G, where they had so much of a lead, and then he just kind of went in for no reason and died and lost the entire game for KT, and they lost all their momentum at that point. If he could work on some of that stuff, like, I think that this team is going to be fantastic. And where I rate KT compared to Gen.G and T1, especially in comparison to T1, I feel like I'm not seeing the same sort of cohesion from T1 and the same sort of confidence. The 5-man unit we saw dominate Spring, where they made the meta, they defined the meta, they were always looking like every decision was deliberate. I feel like that's what I'm seeing from KT. That's what I'm seeing to a lesser extent from Gen.G. There are some errors on the top side from Doran, but KT just seemed to be extremely well prepared for this meta. And every single decision you see from KT, you can be like, I can back this up with what they're exactly trying to do, what their comp is designed to do.
And I think what was so great about KT in the spring was that we talked extensively about how they bounced back from some of their big losses and then immediately developed this new like pick comp style. And so now they have so many different tools that they can kind of do anything. And they're, like you say, there's some really good buffs coming up. They have some crazy pocket picks still, like the Singed is just there lurking, behind Lehens. And they're willing to play this is a team that's willing to play the Yuumi even without the Zeri, which we're not seeing a lot in other leagues like LPL. We've seen a little bit more this last week in LCK, but for the most part, people just kind of want to pair it up with the Zeri, but they're saying no. We're going to play this with Aphelios. We're going to play this with Ezreal. We're going to weak side the Yuumi, force you to dive us, and play around Keen in the top side. And Keen has just been incredibly versatile. And people are going to take this as getting excited about KT, which will inevitably doom them. But no, I'm not getting excited about KT. This is now the prophecy of KT, okay? It is written in fate that they are going to be doing very well. So we don't have to worry about being excited. We're not excited. We are simply believers in the true prophecy of KT, right?
And for me, like, KT has earned our belief. Like, they have earned our respect. And KT of the past would sometimes randomly overperform, and then people would be like, wait, is this team good now? And then because it was an underperformance, fans would misjudge the strength of the team, and then they would get excited, so to speak, and then KT would disappoint them. But right now, they're not disappointing us, and they're consistently good, and they have been for like half of spring season. They were really good. The other half, they were like pretty good, and then they were almost in the LCK finals. They are starting off extremely well. We'll talk about one of the debacles that happened in the Gen.G series where they actually had one good game of those three. But the KT just overall, I think when people are like, "Oh, like it's just a meme, like they're not actually good," I'm like, "No, they are actually really good. They are just a really good team now." Um, Maybe we should transition to talking about the aiming itemization issue.
Yes, because people will say, well, guys, if they're so good, well, why did they lose to Gen.G? Well, it is merely a road bump on their long path to greatness over the course of the summer split, first off. Secondly, the tilting that must have emerged within this KT roster, and they did draft very badly in the third game of that series, but the tilting that emerged from the static Shiv incident probably had a pretty big effect because they really were very convincing in game one of that series, and they were behind. And it was going to be an uphill battle in game number two, but I think what sent them over the edge was what happened. So why don't you describe what happened, Wolf?
So, this was my day off, right? So I was at home, and so I didn't actually. Usually, when these things happen and I'm casting or I'm on the desk, especially when I'm on the desk, I can actually see like physically a lot of the stuff that's happening in the arena. So this time I had to go a lot by hearsay of like what the process was and what was happening. But for those who don't know, Stormrazor is legal and fine. Static Shiv has an interaction with Renata Glass where if you get ulted by Renata with the hostile takeover, you can then kill your own minions and get gold. So you can both get money from your own minions and also deny CS from your opponent. So it's a huge bug. I don't know the exact interactions in which it happens because it's not just like, oh, if you get ulted with Static Shiv, it automatically creates this scenario, but it can happen. And so as a result, Static Shiv is banned completely on this patch. It's fixed on 13.11, so it will be playable in the next patch. And a lot of people are like, well, Renata wasn't even in the game. Okay, so why is it banned even when Renata's not in the game? You can create a world, though, if you don't make this rule to ban Static Shiv entirely, where a champion that's strong with Static Shiv gets picked, and then, for example, the enemy team is like, well, I'll draft Renata now because now you can't pick this item that your champion needs. Like, we didn't, at the time when this rule was made, when the bug was discovered, like, how can Riot know which champions are going to 100% be used with Static Shiv? So I do understand just banning the item completely because in terms of, like, draft stuff, you don't really want to create a world where somebody can actually, like, ban an item by picking a champion. That's quite weird. So aiming bought Static Shiv, and that's kind of a mystery in itself because I don't think he needed extra wave clear in that game necessarily on Aphelios. Maybe he accidentally bought it because he was trying to buy Stormrazor, but ultimately he bought Static Shiv. And
Right.
then the referees realized this a few moments later after a top dive had happened. And then the game was paused because they're like, this is an illegal item, or as Riot put it, forbidden item.
Ooh, forbidden.
The Korean word for this is banned, but they used forbidden for some reason. And so there was a pause, and then the Riot stance was, as far as I've heard, like basically this was instantly decided by the refs. Like the ruling was going to be, you have to go back to the fountain and sell the item. He had already left the fountain, so he can't undo. He has to return to the fountain and sell, and he would have lost about 900 gold from the sale.
Right.
But additionally, of course, in order to get back to the fountain, he would have to leave lane and lose experience and gold from those minions, as well as potentially giving plates
Right.
over to
He
the
a
enemy AD
big
carry.
wave crashed in the bot turret as well, and he was forced to recall.
So the coaching staff of KT was very upset and claimed that it was like a double penalty because he was going to have to like not only sell the item but also lose all of that time in lane, etc., lose all of that gold. They were arguing that there should be an exception made or a chrono break needs to happen. I don't know exactly all of the discussions that happened there during that time with the Riot referees, but it basically was KT trying to negotiate for like about an hour. About 50 minutes went by until LCK told them ultimately like, no, like you need to play. and I assume said something along the lines of, if you do not go back to the game and sell this item now, you will forfeit this game, so tough luck. My biggest frustration with this situation is that KT didn't just accept the penalty. On one hand, I think they should have, but also that LCK allowed this discussion to happen for like an hour. If you're a
Yeah.
referee, rules are
So
rules. You say, tough shit, man. It's the rules. Get back down in your chair,
so
play the game, or forfeit.
yeah, I mean, imagine if a coach could just like run onto the field or the basketball court or whatever, and then just delay a broadcast by an hour while they threw a fit around a rule that they had broken. Now, Ashley Kong tweeted, I believe, that there wasn't actually a rule in place about this, like the item was forbidden. So
That's
there.
right.
But there wasn't actually like a agreed upon punishment, which then allows the coach to argue with you, which is just honestly fucking mind-boggling to me. Like the incompetence of the way that LCK continues to be run. We talked about this a lot last year, where they were just like, well, we don't really have any plans if the teams get COVID, so I guess forfeit your games because the Asian games might happen. Spoiler, they didn't happen. So these forfeits were just complete bullshit. But they seem to just like now they did tell the teams, as far as we can tell, that Static Shiv was a banned item.
Yes.
Okay, now
And
we can.
I got the confirmation. I got the document that was sent to the team, so I was able to confirm that Static Shiv is banned, along with a lot of like really specific weird interactions. Which I'm not going to share all of them because I don't want
Sure.
people to use them, because some of them are still
Yes.
in the game and I don't want that to like spread into solo queue
Yeah,
and ruin
be
things. But
abused.
I
Sure.
the teams were given a specific set of interactions and techniques, as well as champions who do specific things at certain times that are completely banned from the game, from pro play rather. Because some of them are fixed, some of them are not fixed going into the future patches. But they were given that list, and I was able to confirm that, and it's actually towards
Yes.
the top of the list, the Static Shiv being banned.
So, yeah, it's very simple. But the problem here is that, so first off, I agree with you, Wolf. They should have just told the KT coaches, no, this is happening right now, right? But secondly, the reason why this happened is because there was no protocol in place.
Yeah.
Like, how can you ban an item and then not say what happens if the item is bought? There should be a very clear checklist of the player must, if the referee pauses it, upon that pause, the player must immediately return to the fountain via recall and then return the item, sell the item, and that's it, right?
Yeah.
But there wasn't a protocol, which is why all this arguing takes place. But guys, what the fuck is the point of these rules if there's no way to address them within the game? Because you have to be able to point to that rule as a referee and say, no, this is what we're doing, and get the show on with. You can't delay things for an hour while you
Yeah.
argue with the coaches.
And
It's ridiculous.
the biggest loser, the biggest losers, not loser, the biggest losers of this pause are, beyond the fans, obviously, who had to wait for an hour, are the players who are unable to really be involved in this decision, and are not really supposed to communicate with each other during the initial parts of the pause. All of that time that's lost, all of the frustration. The players probably have their own take. Like, maybe Aiming is just sitting there going like, I'm down to sell it, man. This really sucks. I messed up. But like, the coaches are yelling at the referees, and there's a huge argument happening. I mean, from reports, like, I wasn't there, but I've seen fans posting about this. I've heard from people who were in the arena that the discussion was very heated between the referees and Supreme and Hirai, the coaching staff of KT Rolster. And it's just got to be frustrating as a player, like mentality wise, trying to get your head in the game. You had a great game one, you're up 1-0. Game two, itemization problem, right? You made a mistake. Perhaps he even just bought it by mistake, like trying to buy Storm Razor, which is the more common item that he was also, which has a similar build path that he would probably should have built. Picked Static Shiv. Who knows? We don't have a statement on why we thought the item was good or whatever. We don't know. But suddenly this one choice you've made now has affected the entire series. You're playing a much longer, grueling best of three, where now you're going to a third game an hour later than you were supposed to, so you've been in Law Park for an extra hour. I think this decision should have been made fast, and Riot should have amended the rules instantly. I don't know if they even have necessarily amended the rules, but this is one of those things where if it's not in the rule book, the coach does have somewhat of a leg to stand on, but Riot has to put the foot down in these moments.
Well, but yeah, look, it was no one's saying that it wasn't KT's fault, because it was Aiming's fault for buying this item. Was very clear. Like, I think Riot was in the right to do what they did, but come on, guys, can we please just write, like, it's just, even though Riot was correct this time, it's that there wasn't the procedure in place, and there has to be a procedure in place for this. It's like, you can't have a rule that says something's forbidden and then not have a follow-up to say what happens if somebody buys it. Like, it's just obvious. And this, combined with all of the ref fiascos from basically last split and last year, is just, it's really annoying. So I don't know what they need to do or who needs to rewrite these rule books, but clearly there are major flaws that should never have passed muster.
There are some big holes, and you know, like Kespa is the ones who handle the referees, and obviously Riot and the LCK have some oversight on that and like help make sure that Kespa certifies them correctly.
Here's a question for you, Wolf. These should be global rules.
Yeah.
It's not like Static Shiv is just banned in Korea.
Yeah.
Why isn't there the same rule? I mean, do all regions not have a rule about this?
Why also is there not so here another topic, and I don't want to get too into the weeds about this, but like, I do think that it's a bit of a miss that the tournament client isn't. The tournament client is basically just a different patch, but it's exactly the same League of Legends client that everyone else plays on and has like a different setup for draft and stuff like that. But why isn't the tournament client? And I get it, like maybe like 500 people realistically in the world use the tournament client at any regularity in terms of setting up these tournaments. So I get it from an investment standpoint for Riot. Like, does it really make sense to improve this? But why not set toggles for the tournament organizers to where, for example, when certain champions are disabled, that they just don't show up in the pick and bans, and when items are disabled, they cannot be purchased from the shop. Like, then these things can't even happen in the first place, where you can't actually use banned champions, because it's a fun thing too when we're in draft and like a certain champion is disabled and the players hover them, perhaps in protest or like perhaps they're memeing, whatever, but they hover them in champ select because they're still in the game, and the player could lock it in. If the player like accidentally locked it in, who knows what would happen? Like, I hope there's a rule in place for that. But maybe just let's improve the tournament client so that tournament organizers have the power to make sure that these banned interactions are less likely to happen or impossible to happen. I think that would make a huge quality of life for situations like this and inevitable bugs that will come up in the future.
Yeah. Yep. I agree with you. So let's move on and talk about T1 and Gen.G. Hanwha, we'll touch on Hanwha Life briefly first. Thoughts on Hanwha Life? They look about the same. I was actually somewhat pleasantly impressed by Kana's performances this last week, or Kingan's performances rather. Yeah. And Zeka at least looked good on Ari. I have to say that his Gragas still ain't it. I don't know why they keep going back to the Gragas well, but they keep going back there. Viper looks the same, and Clid still hasn't been replaced for reasons that I cannot possibly comprehend.
So, I mean, Zeka had one good game of Gragas, and then I was like, oh, maybe he's okay, maybe he's figured it out, and then we found out no, he hasn't figured it out. It's quite weird. In my opinion, both Kingan and Zeka have such wildly inconsistent performances as players that it just makes you wonder, like, if you think back to the DRX World Championship run, you're like, well, I guess they were just believing it. They were kind of like in their zone and they were hyped, and it was a great meta for them. Like, it was, by the way, in fact, a great meta for those two players. Their best champions were the strongest champions in their role by a large margin. So when Akali is insanely meta, Zeka's happy with this. When Sylas is meta, great. When Aatrox is meta for Kingan and Ornn is meta for Kingan, he's like, all right, cool, I'm having a good time. Ornn is still meta, but you know, Hanwha Life doesn't always play around that playstyle. And I look at them like, well, we still have the same problems. Like, some games they look great, some games they don't. Super inconsistent. Viper looks pretty consistent, but if the team can't play well around him ever, like if they do it half of the time, which is why like Hanwha Life always goes to game 3 because they can only do it exactly 50% of the time. It's just, I mean, I just think this team is going to be straight up 5th place. Like, they're a 50-50 team. They're going to win like half the time, and they're going to be halfway through the standings, and they're going to go to playoffs, and then like they might randomly punch up and beat a good team like they did to Damwon in last season's playoffs. Like, I'm just frustrated with this team because Clid sometimes you're like, ooh, look at that. Like, is he back? Clid Demption? No. And then you're like, nah, he's not back. I'm not sure. He's also extremely inconsistent. And I just, like, when I look at Hanwha Life, I want to think they could be good. And they're not bad. They're just so mid. And when you know the talent that this roster has and how highly heralded like Kingen and Zeka have been, even though you and I are on the same page and that we think they're kind of like they're also kind of mid. It's just been frustrating because there's always these
I'm sorry, Zeka
expectations for
was.
Hanwha.
The question was, is Zeka a patch Zerg at the end of last year? And the answer is Zeka is a patch Zerg, guys.
Yeah.
I hate to say it. We've had a whole split now. We know Zeka's a patch Zerg. Like, just fucking get over it, okay? He could be good on that patch. The Akali Silas patch, he's sick on, guys. It's not that he's bad. He's just not going to win titles without those champions or without becoming massively better.
Yeah, I don't. I feel like Zeka is like the opposite player of BDD in that BDD is fantastic on engaged champions where he can actually be a playmaker and he could be decisive and he can actually warp plays by himself. Zeka is like, I kill the guy with a champion I like, and that's what I do. Like he's not a very supportive player. He doesn't offer a lot of utility. He's an assassin player. He
I mean,
likes
his
to kill
Ari has
the
been
champ.
pretty good. His Ari's been pretty good.
Yeah. I
I
mean,
mean, his Ari's been pretty good, but
it's
beyond
fine,
that,
sure. But it's like it's not as good as the other top RE players in the league, and it's not consistent, right? So
and his Gragas is bad.
it's
That's
just not it,
the
and it's
problem.
super relevant.
And here's the other issue I foresee with Hanwha Life in this meta, where so much is dependent on getting the first kill because we're just in reset city right now. It's just like if you get the first kill, well then Viego starts snowballing, or Jinx starts snowballing, or Zeri starts snowballing, right? Or you have a Yuumi on your team, so when one person dies, then one player on the enemy team has a Yuumi on them is just going to chase everybody down, right? And so the problem with Clid is that Clid will just randomly int, give up a kill, and then just start the reset snowball on his team. Like, positioning is just so critical right now. You saw this towards the end of MSI when it became very clear that this was going to be the meta, where it's like blink and you miss it, the game is over. It's like, is it 23 minutes? Oh, you died? Well, now your entire team's dead and your base is dead.
It's
Just
like now all your turrets are dead, and the enemy team's like 1,000 gold lead is now a 6,000 gold lead.
yeah, and they have Baron, or you just lose, right? If the wave states are in a good place and you start the snowball and one person dies and they just chase you down mid lane with the wave, kill 4 or 5 of your members, then the game just ends, right? And so that's the spot that the game is in right now. And so with a player like Clid, who just consistently mispositions around objectives in the mid and late game, is just a massive liability at the moment. Like, you can't
Yeah,
recover from that right now.
you really can't, and especially on picks like the Viego where you have Flash and Heartbreaker for mobility, and you can't use them to escape. Like you can't react quickly enough. It's frustrating, and like this team is so frustrating as a commentator, as a pundit of the league, where I want to say facts about them, but then I have to be like, but it might happen, but it probably won't happen. And it's just a weird thing. Like it's hard to hype these players up narrative wise, like defending world champions, et cetera, et cetera. Like Viper was world champion 2 worlds ago, and like this team is sick, this team is great. And then it's like this team is actually anti LCK in a weird way, where it's like, look at our legends. Not on this team though. By the way, let's talk about some of the other teams because this one isn't it. And you and I both know this because they had a similar start in spring. This is arguably a little bit more disappointing because they've had a whole split to be better than this, but they might have like a resurgence when they have an easier strength of schedule. And then we'll be like, wait, are they okay now? But then you and I both know also they will just disappoint us and like trip over the finish line at the end.
Hanwha is
And
the
we're
new
just gonna be
KT,
disappointed.
guys. Okay, Hanwha's the new KT.
Yeah.
They've taken the crown of get excited about them, and then they will disappoint you. KT is now the prophesied one. They are the savior that is coming to find redemption this split in LCK. And the other teams that will definitely be losing to them going forward, even though Gen.G won. So going forward, the teams that will definitely be losing to them are Gen.G and T1. And Gen.G took a very important win over T1 this week. Should they have won that best of 3? Did they abuse Zeri towards the end of a game where they were what 6,000-7,000 gold behind in game number 3 in order to repeatedly clean up fights and funnel a ton of gold onto
So
pays? Possibly.
I the Gen.G. So just to go through the T1 Gen.G series, the first game was like I described it as like a shootout. Like they're both like trying to draw their pistols as fast as possible because it was both teams. Oftentimes you have a team that opts into we are strong in the early game. We have strong engage. The other team goes, okay, well I'm going to go for scaling then, so we can actually outscale you as long as we can survive. And usually in most of the metas that have happened over the last like year or so, there's kind of a dichotomy between early game team versus late game team in these types of scenarios. And then the T1 was just like, oh yeah, watch this. We're gonna go even more engaged. We're gonna go even more aggressive. They picked the Malphite, and then you had this engaged comp where it's like, okay, both teams are pressing R and trying to kill somebody instantly. And the first game was just like anybody could have won that one. I thought we had some great plays from Chovy, and then Doran having a great Gnar game where he's able to kill Guma in a critical moment to actually save the game, ends up picking up POG. That first game it's just one of those games where it's just going to be wild. It's going to be volatile. I think neither team was better than the other one significantly in that. It's just Gen.G was able to take that one critical engage and then follow up really well. Chovy had a great flank as well. Like there was some really critical moments where Gen.G made good decisions. But after that first game, it wasn't like, wow, Gen.G's just better than T1. That wasn't really like the moment where you say that. Game 2, the draft from Gen.G was not good, in my opinion, because you have both a Draven that needs a ton of resources in the bottom lane, and then you have a Kayle that needs a lot of resources. And Owner went red to red, so he started red buff, has red buff, paths directly to Peanut's red buff so that he can deny Peanut the ability, because Viego versus Wukong in those early levels, when you have red and they started blue, the Wukong just can't compete in that 1v1. Peanut's not able to smite, steal it away. They can get the dive off onto Kayle. Then Peanut stays, and so 2 kills go over to the Viego. And then it's
And
like,
then they
okay, well,
both come
Doran's
back
game is
for
over.
round
It's done.
2.
And the best part about that game was there was a moment in where they showed Doran's comms when like they were losing a bottom side play, and he was just pushing a top turret by himself at like level 12, and he was like, I'm scaling, and I was like, no, you're not, by the way.
This is solo queue. This is solo queue right here. It's that Kayle player who's like, I'm scaling, guys, and you're just like, and they won't surrender, and you're like, motherfucker, I know you're scaling, but they have a 7,000 gold lead. We don't scale that hard. We lost. Just surrender. Stop wasting my goddamn time, please. No, but I think the funniest part was Peanut came back, and then they just inted again. So it was like the first one was
4
kind of
kills on the Viego.
understandable. But then the Viego's just 4-0. And by the way, in this meta, guys, if Viego is 4-0, like I said, the reset train, that has no brakes anymore. Like, especially when you also have even Gumayushi's Zeri, which we know isn't good, right? But when you also have the Zeri there, it's just the cleanup is absolutely insane. And so, yes, the game was rather doomed. I agree.
And I had actually people like sending me crazy like death threats and DMs saying that I know Wolf is the T1 bias caster because I said the game was over after Peanut died in the top side,
right?
And 2 kills went over, and then he got 4 kills, and I was like, guys, I don't know, it's over. It's just like science, okay? Like it's just math. Like I don't know what to tell you guys.
Well,
I'm not T1 biased. I'm just telling you guys the facts of the game.
Yeah,
okay?
basically, like you had a Kayle that was super behind, you had a jungler that was super behind versus a fed Viego, and you just had a free farming Zeri Yuumi in the bot lane, and people are gonna say, "Wow, Gumayushi finally won with Zeri." Guys, he didn't do anything. He didn't do anything. Like, I don't even know if he's good at Zeri now because he didn't do anything that whole game.
Yeah.
We still don't know if they can play Zeri or not because that game wasn't about Zeri. It was not won by Zeri whatsoever.
Yeah, I'm not sold on his Zeri still. And it is oddly suspicious that T1 keep avoiding picking Zeri all the time, even though it's really strong. And teams also just leave it open against T1 sometimes and just go, like, it seems like you guys aren't very confident on this pick. So I'm a little bit sus on Guma Zeri myself as well. But then going into the third game, that game was like, it wasn't to the same degree of extremely over because it wasn't a Kayle just getting shit on basically for the first like 8 minutes of the game, and it's just there's no winning. You can't play around the Draven bottom side or anything like that. It was just like a pretty massive lead for T1. And Doran was extremely behind, got dunked on in lane super hard. and he was like 0-4-3 or something like that. But then Chovy followed up on Peanut's Maokai ults incredibly well, consistently. And even Doran, who had no items, like he was sitting on like half of a Divine Sunderer, was following up and hitting stuns, and then consistently low resources, was able to help turn some fights around. And then, this game was a lot about Zeri because I think almost no other AD carry could have followed up on the great engages as well as Zeri could and could still carry those fights. Like eventually you do run out of steam as almost every other AD carry. I'd say maybe Jinx is like the closest one that could have maybe popped off in a similar situation. So a lot of it is about Zeri, but I think Zeri never has those opportunities. Pays never has those chances to get that pentakill if we don't see T1 kind of tunneling on this Maokai. Peanut ults really well, survives so many of these fights by a razor-thin margin to allow then Chovy to come in, to then Doran comes in. Doran buys Zonias. He had some really good stasises, constantly pushing the Draven back who's low range. I thought that was a beautiful game from Gen.G, all things considered. Like, Doran, in both game 1 and 3, kind of ints a little bit, doesn't flash the Malphite ult, for example, in game 1, but then turns it around with the Gnar, plays incredibly well in the team fights. Game 3, similar situation. He falls extremely far behind, but then makes really clutch plays and follows up on those engages really well.
Calm down there. Calm down there. Because I understand what you're saying, but also, why can't Gen.G just have a top laner that doesn't go 0-4 in a Jax Gragas matchup? Look, it's not a good matchup for Jax. Okay, I get that. But can we just start with not inting? Can I just have that guy on Gen.G? Keen, can you go to Gen.G? See, this is what's so ridiculous about this argument. Is like, I guess Doran played okay and helped somewhat in digging them out of the hole, but he also dug the hole.
Sure. Like I'm not like I'm not trying to say.
Here's what I don't. Doran is the guy who digs the hole, and then you just have to hope he keeps digging his way all the way on through at some point in time. That's Doran.
Yeah, maybe he'll pop out on the other side of the planet.
Exactly.
But like, I'm not trying to give Doran like massive credit, but I thought the way that, like, the crisis management, let's call it, for Gen.G and how they played around the deficit that they had and how decisive they were, I think is both like really indicative of what this team is capable of and how much experience they have together as a roster. Obviously, Pays being a newer part of this, but he's already had a split that he's won. He's gone deep in an international tournament with this roster, so he is now gelling with this roster and playing very well with it. But it's also kind of a vote of lack of confidence in T1's ability to close out games when they have this type of lead. And I'm not saying T1's a bad team by any means, but I think that T1 is a weaker version right now of their spring selves. They don't seem as confident together. They're not as decisive. And like the movement isn't deliberate, like I said earlier. I think that's the best way I can describe how I feel about T1 based on week 1 is they were like a 10 out of 10 coordination. Now they're like a 8.8 out of 10. So still very good, but you don't think it's like the same, or I don't think it's the same master class level of every single choice we make. We have a strong reasoning for it. And even if someone is dying, we're always getting something else out of this. Cross map, for example, or okay, somebody is dying at the beginning of this fight, but we're actually going to turn beautifully. It just felt like they were super indecisive, especially in that final game around some of those objectives, and then tunneling on Peanut, and then the turn comes through with Maokai. Stuff like this just looked like Gen.G was the better team to me in that series, despite Doran's best efforts to make it seem otherwise. So I think they're the stronger team right now. Now, it's week 1, and I actually hate when these matchups happen in week 1, where it's like D+ versus Gen.G in week 1, or T1 versus Gen.G in week 1.
Yeah, but they gotta spike those ratings in week 1, get everybody all hot and bothered for
it just ends up being a bad. It's like not the best showcasing of what these teams' potential is going to be when it matters more in playoffs. Round 2 is the real one. This is kind of the fake one. So I don't want to judge too much based off of this, but if somebody said, what's your, like, if you had to give your take, I mean, this is my take. I think Gen.G is stronger right now. I put them above T1, even though Doran seems to be such a massive liability.
That's fair. I mean, at least I will say about Zeus is that, unlike whenever he plays in high stakes matches, both domestically and internationally, I got to see some fucking cool Zeus plays again this week. I just don't understand where his like confidence and vision and playmaking go in the big games. Because again, like we got to see some great plays on Gragas in that third game of the series where he was just dumpstering him in lane. We got to see a really nice solo kill on Malphite in the first game of the series versus Doran's Gnar. And this is the player who is going to come and make the game. In the game they won, he made a really sick bot lane dive with the Scion, using the Yuumi to go all the way through and shut Pace down. Because the only win condition after they had completely dominated the top lane Kayle was if Pace cashed in. Well, that doesn't happen because he just, as its gorgeous Scion ult, flashes on top of Pace and kills him.
So beautiful. Yeah, that was honestly one of the coolest plays of the whole series.
I mean, it was sick. And like, so we got 3 very good Zeus games out of this series. Where is Zeus when it fucking matters? That's what's so infuriating, because especially a lot of fans who are like, oh, I'm only going to watch the LCK finals, or, oh, I'm only going to watch, the bracket at MSI or Worlds. They just don't see it. They never get to see good Zeus. They never get to see the amazing plays he's capable of. And fortunately, Zeus is very young, so I'm hoping he can overcome some of this, but I just need more of these Zeus plays when it really matters, because we got to see again in this series how good he is.
Yeah, it's really frustrating as someone who's also hyped up Zeus and also hyped up T1 quite significantly, because I think that there have been significant long portions of time where T1 is clearly the best team in the LCK based on like what we have seen and what we can actually look at. And you can never see the future, right? You never know when Zeus is just going to turn it off. But he does turn it off, right? And it's frustrating when I try to sing Zeus's praises, when you sing Zeus's praises, when Chronicles sings Zeus's praises, and then we watch him not live up to what we already know he's capable of. And it is frustrating. And I've said this a lot. I think this is definitely the last year of this roster. I just see no world in which this roster stays together after this. Even if they win Worlds, it's almost like even more of a reason to split up. It's like, okay, we did it. Let's all go our separate ways. But this team has failed together at the highest level more than like any roster, perhaps even in like the history of League of Legends has done. Like to go as deep as them and fail to cross the finish line, fail in the finals, fail in that winners finals, or not winners, losers, I guess, where they ended up losing in MSI ultimately. But like failing at the highest level with this team, even though they've performed so well domestically, like over and over and over and over again. I mean, I know teams like DFM like stayed together and like kept going to internationals and fell, but they didn't go to like the end of the international tournament. You know what I mean? And I just don't see. I think for these players, like they might be better off in a different team, and maybe it's good for their health as well. And it's also an expensive roster. Like T1 has to spend a ton of money to keep all these players together. So I do kind of think it's the last run for this roster. I can't see a world where they stay together after this. So I really hope they can find that consistent form when we move forward. It's still early days, right? There's still a lot of weeks for us to get excited and do some T1 circle jerk. Like those times may come, but right now, I just feel like the decisiveness isn't the same level that we saw in
Spring. I also one of the things that was very annoying for me about MSI is that people were pretending that T1 like wasn't hands down the best team in the world in the like Hail of Blades Keria Caitlyn support meta, which is just wrong. I mean, that iteration of T1 during that meta was legitimately one of the most spectacular teams I have ever seen in League of Legends based on the eye test. And I have been watching this game for its entire competitive history. Okay. Yeah. Like they were clearly the best team in the world on those patches because they could do things that other teams couldn't do. And it had sunk right down into their pick composition style meta, but their long range engages, the amount of poke damage they were putting out, their lane dominance, it was crazy. Like they were clearly the best team in the world. And as the meta moved away from them, they weren't anymore. And that's fine, but we're not going to rewrite history as to that they weren't such a fabulous team during that period.
Yeah. And I mean, beyond that, like after they made the bot marksman meta and the Halo Blades, like Caitlyn support, etc., they then defined like the Gragas mid meta and Gragas being a flex pick, not just being a top laner. Like they did so much in that spring season, it's insane. And the whole world followed, right? Like everything that T1 was doing, the rest of the world kind of copied. And then arguably as it moved away from that, they didn't adapt as quickly because they were so focused on like our way is the best way, and it was, and the whole world agreed. The whole world was like, wow, yeah, that is the best way. Let's do that. So I do agree. I think this is the frustrating part about international events to me is I think international events also. This is going to sound out there, and this is like maybe my craziest take of the episode, but the international event doesn't always tell you who the best team is in the world, actually, because it's a short tournament over the course of one small patch, which wildly is different from the patch that you played on to get to the tournament. And while I think we do have, because we have no other metrics, we do kind of have to agree that like said team wins the international event, beats all the other teams around the world. Like we have to say they're the best team in the world, generally speaking. But like from a factual, like 100, are we 100% sure? Like, was DRX the best team in the world? They won worlds, but like, I sometimes think international events can give you a warped
Well,
perception of who the best team really is because it's on one small patch with not a lot of prep time compared to a regular season league.
yeah. Well, I mean, that's the problem is that when you are testing for two different things, which you do in League of Legends, right? Which is that, a lot of the results are based off of a long regular season with double round robins. I mean, that's just how it is. Or in LPL's case, like single round robins. Okay, whatever, guys. You understand what I mean. Long round robin seasons outside of LEC right now. And that's the thing that you're testing for is kind of this consistency week in, week out, lots of time to prepare on the patch, lots of matches on any given patch. And then you throw the teams into a tournament, which is I mean, basically entirely a bracket for the top teams because they're not participating in the play-ins, right? Then there's very little time to adjust. And you're testing for something different at that point in time. And that doesn't mean that the same teams won't win. I mean, JDG won LPL and then JDG also won an MSI. And we know JDG is a spectacularly talented team. But it's not like the Counter-Strike circuit where you have a series, for the most part, a series of tournaments that are all taking place in approximately the same time frame, just in different locations with slight iterations on the format, but it's basically the same thing. And also Counter-Strike has a lot less patching, right?
Yeah. I mean, you have to play to win LCK. You have to win on 5 patches, basically. Like you will play through because a patch comes out every 2 weeks. You play through 9 weeks of regular season play, and then there's a playoffs patch, right? So you basically play, generally speaking, through 5 different patches, and you're tested across all of those changes. Whereas you go to MSI or Worlds, and you're like, hope you're good at this one because there isn't going to be any fallback.
And just to describe, I think Wolf's point better. Wolf's not saying that the Chinese teams, the Bilibili and JDG, were not better on this patch. They were clearly
legit better. Like they were
they were
much
clearly
better. They were clearly way better.
It's that when we talk about peaks for teams, the unfortunate reality of League of Legends is that T1's peak, where I firmly believe that they were the best team in the world, happened at a point in time where we did not have international competition or even playoffs within the regions, right? So
yeah. And I think that part of the fun of MSI and part of the fun of these international events is that you test all teams' adaptability. Like that from an analyst perspective, it's really exciting to see how every team is going to change. And like sometimes in the first week of the tournament, you see like very different, wildly different reads from teams, and then everyone eventually slowly moves towards one stronger meta as like teams had their own scrim ideas and stuff like that. And that's one of the exciting parts about it for sure. But ultimately, it does punish teams that had a different read, right? Ultimately, and I'm not going to take anything away from the LPL teams. I literally said at the beginning of this episode, like they were way better. We got massively outclassed. But yeah, I think that no one can say because T1 didn't win MSI that they weren't the best team because at that time where they were running the Halo Blades meta. So
yeah. Yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting. So you said, sorry, I'm just we get this straight. Earlier, you said that 1311 is going to be coming up this next week.
yes, it will be
LCK?
It will be next week. Usually it's 2 weeks per patch, but for some reason this one is coming out based on the schedule after week 1. So we'll be moving to 13.11. No nerfs to Zeri, but Triforce is getting nerfed, so it will indirectly be a slight nerf to how Zeri is going to be played, I think. And then Felios gets nerfed. You've got some small buffs to Twisted Fate. Ivern is maybe relevant.
So, question: can Ivern be picked? Because they made a lot of changes to him, or is he banned?
Ivern will be playable, as far as I understand.
Okay.
And based on what the LCK has done with similar champions in the past, I don't think we'll see our top teams play it initially. I think they'll wait and see like what the read is, because Ivern is another one of those fragile jungle champions to where if you don't have prio in the LCK and you're playing Ivern and the enemy player is like Rek'Sai, for example, is also strong, or Viego, they will just find you and kill you and like repeatedly destroy your ability to farm the jungle, and your ability to like shield the AD carry and do Ivern's utility things won't matter because you just fall so far behind. The same reason why when Fiddlesticks and Karthus were really strong, or considered really strong, the LCK was kind of like, that's a little bit fragile. We don't really play that. And we did see Canyon pick up the Karthus at some point, but I have the feeling based on my experience with the LCK that we won't see a lot of Ivern from our top teams unless the weaker teams kind of test it out. Like I could see Umpty playing it 100%. Like he likes to play picks like this. If Pyosik was still in the LCK, he would 100% play it, right? But we'll see. I'm not saying it's not going to happen. I'm just saying I feel like most teams will shy away from it at least in the first few days of play.
Yeah, the Rel rework is also there. I assume Rel is also potentially available.
As far as I understand, she will be playable. No one has told me otherwise thus far, so it's usually only like really big reworks like what we saw with Aurelion Sol, where the LCK disables these champions. Smaller like mid-scope stuff, the LCK just is like, no, that's cool. We're allowing that. So Rel, I believe, as far as I know, will be playable. Mixed opinions on whether she'll actually see jungle play. I've talked to a few pros about it, and they're like, not quite good enough. She was hotfixed on this patch and is very strong on 13-11, compared to where she'll ultimately land. But I still think most people agree, not quite strong enough.
All right. Well, are there any games that you're particularly excited for this coming week? I mean, it's kind of slim pickings here. Maybe KT versus Liiv SANDBOX, or T1 versus Liiv SANDBOX. Gen.G versus Kwangdong, or Hanwha versus Kwangdong might be good, depending on how good Kwangdong actually are.
Yeah, I think Wednesday is overall pretty good. Like Hanwha versus DRX, with DRX playing pretty well in their match against D+, could be interesting, especially when you consider how inconsistent Hanwha has been. And then the Gen.G versus Kwangdong series is interesting in that we'll see Kwangdong against a real team, and in my opinion, the strongest team right now in Gen.G. Plus the fact that last time they met was the crazy, like, weird game where Peanut went out of the Drake pit and they ended up losing to Kwangdong at the end of regular season, and it was a huge upset that Gen.G actually lost to them. So maybe there's a little like revenge storyline there potentially. So we know Kwangdong can beat Gen.G. Will they do it this time? I don't think so, but I think the series will be good to see kind of where Kwangdong is at when they run up against a team that's actually top tier instead of the very weak opponents they had, the really easy week in week 1.
Yep. And after that, of course, next week we get the telecom war, which is what I'm really excited about, because this is KT's time. So it is written, it is known that KT will beat T1 this time around, right?
Yeah, I mean, we'll see what happens in week 2, but if I had to predict right now, I would predict KT at this moment in time. So I know I think you're memeing a little bit, but I'm not 100% sure because you seem so sold on them.
I am very sold on them. I am very.
But
It is partially a joke, but I am also very sold on them.
I think they're very good, and I think that the next patch is very good for them. And if Cuz can play Rek'Sai, then that's a really good thing for KT. If that ends up being relevant, is one of his best champions. So,
all right. Well, there we go. That'll wrap up our first episode of the summer split of the Monte and Wolf Show. We're getting all of our shows back online over the next couple of weeks. As usual, we have Summoning Insight. That has been moved to live on Wednesdays, VOD on Thursdays for you guys. Best Damn League Show is starting up this next week. Power Spike is starting the week after, and we will be back in a week from today to talk about the latest round of LCK games. Thanks for watching, guys.